Hello and welcome to another edition of School Talk. I'm Jon Wensky, Vice Chair of the School Committee. And on today's program, it'll be a joint discussion with members of School Committee and the Board of Selectmen to talk about the operational override question that'll be on the May 4th ballot. And joining me today are Chair of the Board of Selectmen, Beth Casavant, Chair of the School Committee, Sandra Fryc, and Selectman John Samia. Welcome to you all. Beth, I want to start with you first with regards to the unanimous support for this operational override question. That'll be on the May 4th ballot. Can you take us through the process of how that came to be and what was involved in gaining that level of support from the Selectmen?
Sure, John, I'd be happy to. So as you all know, and as you mentioned at your previous episode of this show, the Selectmen voted to place a $9.5 million operational override on the May 4th ballot. That is the annual town election. We felt that it was important not to ask the voters to come out twice, and also felt that it was important to put it on the ballot at this time because there truly is a structural deficit that is not going to be overcome. And without asking the voters for this additional revenue at this time, there will be an impact to not only our schools, but to our municipal departments as well. And we believe that the degrading of services would be so significant that we felt that obligation to make sure that we brought this question to the voters so that the entire community has a part in the decision as to what kind of community we do want to have going forward, whether we value those services enough to come up with the additional revenue to maintain them, or if we feel that we need to cut back in ways that will truly change what it is that we know and really value in our community. So those were the reasons why now. It did take, it seems, I think, to people from the outside a while for the Board of Selectmen to vote, and that was for a number of reasons. One, you have to know the number that you're asking for before you can vote on it. And as you both know from your work on the school committee, it took some time to really zero in on that number. And a lot of the work was done in what we had called the 2-2 meetings, which have been going on for over a year now. 2 members of the Board of Selectmen, 2 members of the school committee, Town Manager Mizikar, Dr. Sawyer, and then Mr. Collins, Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations, coming together and really hammering out what do we need to be sustainable? What do we need so that we're not always in a position where we have to reduce? What is that number that's going to be able to carry us through the next 4 years without having to come back to the town and say, we need more, or we can't do what we want to do with what we have, and we're going to be reducing programs. So that's why it took some time.
Sure, and you spoke to the collaboration of Board of Selectmen and School Committee. Certainly, this is a much different approach than 2014. A lot of forward thinking, future financial planning, and certainly the commitment to the residents that were made through this, the framework that we agreed to. John, you want to speak a bit to how this is much different from the last time we visited this question?
Sure. So just a little bit of history. In 2007 and 2013, there were a couple fiscal study committees that really did an analysis of all the revenue and expenditures that the town had. In both cases, the conclusion was very similar. It's the town has very limited opportunities to raise revenue, and they've really done everything that they can to strive and maintain efficiencies. In 2014, when the override was put on the ballot, Beth had just talked about this. The pivotal question, and it's the same as today, was basically, do we want to continue to have the level of services that residents have come to enjoy and expect, or do we want to become a different service model? And 7 years later, we have the same question in front of voters. Now, in 2014, it was a $5.5 million override. There was a commitment. It was, we will strive to have this last for 5 years. It lasted for 7. But after that, there wasn't a lot of granularity. There wasn't that commitment to work together. There wasn't caps on municipal and school spending, and then shared accounts as well. How it's different is that there's a lot of granularity. There is the commitment to 4 years. There is a lot of modeling that has been done. There's agreement by the Board of Selectmen and the school committee with a document that talks about our agreement to the taxpayers of Shrewsbury, where it talks about us continuing to collaborate. As Beth talked about, for the last 14 months before the pandemic started, there were conversations going on between the boards realizing and seeing where we wanted to go as a community, talking as elected officials, and then the pandemic came. And those conversations that we had were absolutely essential. So this is different in terms of the written document. We have an override statement that's here. We have the commitment by both boards. At March 16th, we all voted. We had a joint session. We voted on these commitments that are available on the town website. But again, while we all committed in 2014, we talked about 5 years and got 7. This is far more detailed. And it was a far more collaborative process. We talked about what the cost would be. We also talked about a stabilization account. That is also a new concept. What is that? Well, with $9.5 million in year one, we'll have about $3.1 million going to a stabilization account that will be used, view it as retained earnings, that will be utilized for future years, so we can stand behind that 4-year commitment. In year 2, there'll be about $1.6 million, I believe, in that stabilization account. And then years 3 and 4, it flips, and you start to pull from that account. But it was a far more, 2014, it was much needed. This was a much more, to me, it was municipal government working together, as it always has been, but even better. And working together to have a commitment, as we always have done, in the best interest of the community, but it's with increased transparency and, again, more details around a lot of our commitments.
Yeah, certainly the collaboration between the school committee and Board of Selectmen, in my perspective, is groundbreaking, for this town. And not only does it, benefit schools, it will benefit municipal services as well. I know a lot of times we talk about, school budget challenges. Sandy, certainly we came into this year having to reduce 30 full-time employees. You can speak a little bit about the challenges that we faced to get to this moment in terms of our budget plan for next year.
Sure, and I think we want to step back and we look at FY21. We had a $1.9 million reduction in our budget along with, to balance it, and along with a 30 reduction in personnel. And the magnitude of that budget crisis, while exacerbated by the pandemic, it was really a product of this structural deficit. And we do have a 5-year strategic priorities and district plan. And we haven't asked our district leadership to add to the budget development process. And we're looking forward to this new override because this is something that we need to do. We need to add back. And that's something we haven't done in FY20. Any addition that we added to our budget was through private donations or through grants. So we're hoping to be able to finally start adding back. And the current gap that we're looking at right now is a $4.9 million gap. And in addition to the 30 personnel that we decreased, we're looking to potentially have to decrease another 48.7. So this could be significantly impactful to our educational process, and the magnitude of that would be increased class sizes, reduced educational services for all students, elimination of elementary media centers, and reduced electives at the high school. So we are looking at this as something that's worse than the 2014 period. And I am very thankful to John. I know you brought forward these 2-2 meetings last February, and I think the collaboration with the Board of Selectmen is probably better than we've seen in my years on the committee, and it's really been a transparent process. And I think the voters will have the opportunity, this is really a watershed moment for our community, to make a decision to continue educational and municipal services and how we fund them. And it's a bright line moment. What are we going to do moving forward?
Certainly, and certainly opening the new Beale Elementary School.
Absolutely.
As planned and as promised, to offer, free full-day kindergarten to all families is another critical step. We know that, staffing up that school adequately will require about 32 full-time employees. So again, really important to our, focus on, improving class sizes, especially at the elementary level. Taking a step back from schools for a moment, but thinking about the community-wide benefits of the override plan. Beth, when we talk about town services and looking ahead, this is certainly also about the municipal services and the improvements there. Can you give us a little perspective on improvements to town services and how this, override will impact that?
Sure, absolutely. So the $9.5 million override breaks down to $5 million for the schools, and then $1 million in the town, municipal departments. And then 3 million would go to the stabilization fund that John spoke about. And then another 300,000 would be used to reduce our dependence on free cash in the operating budget. So there are needs in the municipal budget. People often don't notice them because your trash gets picked up every week. When it snows, we plow the roads. So it's hard to notice that there's service constraints, but there are. And it's things that maybe you don't see as much, like the economic development coordinator position, which we don't have. And there's value to having that position because the more economic activity we have in this community, the better it is for all of the residents as far as sharing that tax burden. We are looking to do a strategic plan with the community that would include involvement from residents, so that community engagement piece to find out exactly what people want to see from their municipal government aside from the basics. We would like to have some social workers with the police department, not just one social worker, but preferably more than one for a community our size, and a full-time outreach coordinator for the senior center. With the pandemic, the senior center has been closed, but that doesn't mean that the staff hasn't been working. They've actually been working quite more hours than normal trying to get vaccination appointments for the many seniors in our community. So that's an important piece to have that outreach coordinator be full-time. There's something in there for the library, increased page hours, which is something that the library staff has been asking for many, many years, way back from when I can remember when I was on the library board of trustees. That was still something that was asked for every year during budget hearings, and an increase to the materials budget. So there are ways to enhance the experience. It's also really important to note, I think, that in the current budget, as the manager has projected without the override in it, the only increase in the municipal staff is related to the opening of the Beal School. And if we aren't able to open that school, those dollars would then be put toward the school budget, but they would never be enough to fill that $5 million gap. And I just want to touch on one thing when you mentioned not being able to open the Beal School is a question we get about, well, how did you ask for a school when you couldn't open it? You know, in 2018, when we asked for the school, no one thought pandemic was going to come and wipe out basically our local receipts or the money that we depend on from revenue that we were going to use to open the school. And the money to build the school is there. That's a capital expenditure. That's the debt exclusion that people voted for in 2018. But the people to staff it, that's a recurring expense. And without an override, we don't have the funds to meet that demand for recurring expenses.
Right, yeah. Go ahead, John.
Just one thing I was going to add is, you look two short fiscal years ago from where we were projected to be because of COVID. So there are two different issues here that we're faced with. We've lost, from 2 years ago, 3.8 million of Schedule A receipts, and then you put on another 1.7 million of pension money that we originally thought, while not directly related to COVID, but added together. That's $5.5 million of additional revenue that we expected to have. Circumstances beyond our control. Obviously, the pandemic was beyond everybody's control, but that changes the financial landscape, right? And that's where we find ourselves today. And we already were razor thin.
Right.
So now you pull that away, and in 2014, it was viewed as a reset, right? It provided us with the revenue to be able to continue to provide the services, and that's what this would be as well. It's a reset, to have that baseline, to be able to give that level of services. And again, I want to emphasize that all analysis, we are a well-run operation in the schools, well-run in the municipal side. Would have to be, if you look at our per pupil expenditure, if you look at our tax rate, we understand that this would not be easy for everybody. We're absolutely mindful of that, are committed to finding anything statutorily permissible to help with that. But we also look at where we are and to maintain who we are. And to be able to perfect that, it's to be able to go forward, this is necessary, particularly in light of all the lost revenues that we had, to be able to continue doing business the way that people have grown to expect.
Right. And I think we have to differentiate between the 2014 override, because this is different. This is an override stabilization model, where in 14 we knew we had an issue, but it wasn't a long-term solution. And this type of model that Mr. Mizikar has brought forward will not only solve the short-term issue with the gap that we have, but it will also begin that long-term solution with the stabilization fund. And then the commitment that our two boards have agreed to will set that parameters, and it's that whole, it's a reliable, predictable, and a stable source of recurring revenue, which is what we need to start getting at this structural deficit issue that we have had longstanding in this community, way before the 2014 override even.
And related to that, an important thing that Beth touched upon is the strategic planning. That's an important aspect that we've all talked about during our conversation today. But it's really an opportunity to reach out to the community and say, ask, who do you want to be? Before the pandemic started, actually, Beth and I had done some work to look at a lot of visioning that communities had done, 2030, 2040, not detailed everything, but really asking residents what you expect your municipal government to be. We're public servants, whether it's being as elected officials or superintendent or town manager. And that's the next natural leg. This past year, we adopted board goals, we had town manager goals, and then the town manager went to his department heads and asked, what about the next 5 years? Well, it's a little hard if you start out that we don't even know if we can do what we can next year. This isn't pie in the sky activities that they're looking for, but it's able to improve the quality of life for all individuals in Shrewsbury.
Right, and the commitment states that we will maintain or improve versus status quo, which we know sometimes because of inflationary costs is really a cut budget. So I think this adds that commitment to the members of the community that it's actually will stay improvement, which we haven't seen.
Yeah, I mean, you release level-setting expectations for the community as to what they can expect. And, it's something, it's guidelines that we hadn't provided, in 2014. That's what makes this much different.
Right.
I know we talked about recurring expenses, and I think you mentioned it for Beale School in particular. And I think, one of the questions that I receive a lot, during, PTO meetings that we've had is around COVID federal stimulus money and what that money is used for, what it is and what it isn't, essentially. And when we think about, I know from a school perspective, COVID stimulus money is kind of a one-time restricted use specific to, COVID-related items. I know in the schools, we certainly had to buy, say, new desks. We had to staff up with COVID coordinators, and that's where that stimulus money goes to. We know we just had another stimulus wave
Right.
come at us, but again, that's one-time restricted use. I want to talk through that in light of the override and, how that is different, with the COVID stimulus money. So Beth, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
And I know,
Or-
John, you actually do a wonderful job explaining it, and I would turn it over to you for
Sure.
this
That's
piece.
good.
Sure. So a couple facts before I go into this. We know roughly we spent about, as a community, $4.7 million related to efforts connected with COVID. That was not originally budgeted. That was funded through grant money, through reimbursement. And that is not built in our fiscal year 22 budget. We don't have any of that in there. So let's talk about the stimulus money to date. We've roughly expended most of that, a lot of that to the schools through the hybrid model, to buy the PPE, to do the cleaning afterwards. But this new stimulus money, as has the past, does have restrictions in timing. We know that right now, we don't know a lot, right? And Beth talked about this long process. When we voted to put the override on the ballot, it was to have as much information as possible. What we do know, which is not a lot, but it's important, 50% will come in 21, 50% will come in 22. We know there'll be restrictions. It's on premium pay, it's on direct response, I believe, it's sewer, water, broadband, which is an odd sort of grouping. But then the only area that we have that would be a direct impact to our budget is potentially lost revenue. That's a one-time shot in the arm. I think through the meeting or two ago, Mr. Mizikar presented that to us. That's at best about $2.6 million. That barely makes a dent. In the problem, it creates even a larger cliff in years out through one-time revenue, right? So what else do we know? We know it will be restricted. We know it will not cure the structural deficit. Again, by definition, a structural deficit is when recurring expenses exceed recurring revenues. This is not a recurring revenue. This will not satisfy that. And so it will not solve it. And the other thing that Beth had talked about earlier too in the process, and we talked a lot about during the board, is because we've grappled with this, is if we do receive funds and they can be used in normal operations, we'll supplant dollars from the override to the extent we can in that given year. So we will, the best we can, do a reduction if we can do that. And that's a commitment that we've made. We've talked about that during several of our meetings. And that is just an opportunity. Another area that we talked about, so that's a large piece of this, over $11 million. A lot of it we can't use. Or if we can use, it's to cover areas that aren't covered in our budget that are really carrying forward from fiscal year '21. Another area that had been presented was, looking at sewer projects. I think presented about 17.6 million of sewer projects, maybe these dollars could go towards. But again, what this may translate into are lower sewer rates. You take dollars from the stimulus and you, instead of using sewer funds, you utilize those funds, and then it would be a lower rate possibly for ratepayers, because now you're using stimulus dollars instead of rate premiums to fund the ongoing operations. So there's that commitment to look at every which way to utilize these stimulus funds in a way to help us, but it's not a cure.
Right.
And that's what we want to make clear, that we did wrestle with this in at least 3 meetings. What does this mean? And it was the great unknown, but what is known again is this does not at all solve our structural deficit. It's one-time revenue. It will be restrictive. And even from what we know now, it can only be utilized as a fraction to help a tiny bit close the gap that we're looking at in fiscal year '22.
Right. And I think along stimulus funds, we have timing issues with the opening of Beal.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't dovetail well with that timing issue. So, and you also don't set the tax rate for the town until November.
Yes.
So we've got a lot of time between then and now. And for us, we have, May is the optimal time it's the annual town meeting. And for us, for hiring, we need that time. If there is a yes vote, we need that time to do the hiring. And we hope that it's a yes vote, because it is this moment for the community. And, I do believe that the community will support municipal and town services, because that is what they want to support. But timing is a really big issue, and stimulus funds just aren't dovetailing with it. And like John said, it's a one-time. It's not the recurring revenue that we need to move forward.
Right.
And just one piece on timing that on March 23rd presented to us, and there's a nice timeline in our slide deck, which is available online, that when we were looking at a ballot question would be May 4th. Annual town meeting is May 22nd. The ARP funding guidance is June 8th.
Right.
So we don't even know, that's a best case, 90 days out.
Right.
So we can't make any decision whatsoever, and that's not a way to operate good government. And then, as Sandy said, the tax rate deadline is November 30th. So, again, there's that commitment with the information that we have, the commitment to utilize these funds to the extent possible to supplant taxpayer dollars where possible, but we do know that it will not supplant the challenge that we have.
No, and we discussed this as a board at length.
Right.
I mean, originally, when Mr. Mizikar gave me the call and said, looks like we're getting $11 million in stimulus money, I thought, geez, we can't go and ask the community for this override. But then the more we talked about it, I really came to understand that if we use the one-time revenue for a recurring expense that we're going to have year after year after year, we'd actually be setting the community up for an even larger override ask a year or 2 years down the road. And that's not strong financial management. It just
Right.
isn't. And so now is the right time. It's the responsible question to ask the voters to decide. How do you want your community to move forward in a time that's very challenging for everyone? We recognize that. Every person sitting at this table is a taxpayer. I have a child in the school system. I think what I see when I look at this plan is that that phenomenon that happens where my child that's older has a completely different experience in school than my child that's younger, even though there's only 3 years between them, stops.
Right.
We stop chipping away. And someone who moves into this community today is going to have the same service level and the same experience as someone who moves into this community 3 years from now. So
Right.
it's a municipal and it's a school benefit.
Right. And Beth, I think you raise a good comment as well, because we do understand there are people in the community who may not be able to afford it, or it will make it a little more difficult for them maybe to have other types of things within their home or in their life, and we do recognize that. But we also have to make decisions as elected officials about the entire community and what is best for municipal and school services. Can you speak to tax rates for Shrewsbury, even with an override compared to surrounding communities?
Sure. So as John said, we don't, or you might have said, Sandy, we don't set the tax rate until November. Currently, we're at $13.19 per thousand. This will add $1.62 to the tax rate, depending on what we set as a board in November when we know more about the stimulus money, how much we need to actually raise the tax levy. This isn't going to change us from being one of the lowest as far as tax rate and tax bills go for surrounding communities that are similar to us in their size and their complexity. We will still be an extremely well-managed, fiscally responsible town. We're not looking to ask for money so that we can spend it foolishly. One thing that I can say with complete confidence is that both the Board of Selectmen and the school committee know how to manage the funds that they have, and that those funds are always spent with the utmost respect to the taxpayers who provide those funds. We will continue to look for grant opportunities wherever possible to supplement our budgets and to partner with other communities and other departments as a way to share the expenses of the services that we need to provide. We are hopeful that when this override passes, we can add that economic development coordinator and really start making sure that we are taking advantage of any economic development opportunity that could possibly come our way. But back in 2014, Mr. Morgado prepared a slide that said we would need 5 Northborough crossings to create the revenue from the commercial tax base in order to reduce the burden on residents. That's not coming. We are what we are. We are a mostly residential community with a very small opportunity for commercial revenue, but we need to be able to capitalize on those opportunities, and having that coordinator, that person dedicated to that, is only a service to everyone.
Definitely.
Could Beth or John, can you speak to a comment that Mr. Mizikar made, and I hadn't thought of it this way, because we are primarily a residential community, when there is this increase, it's spread across more homes, it's spread more evenly. Can you speak to that? I hadn't thought of
Sure,
that.
yeah, I mean, do you want to take, do you know what she's referring to? He just said because there's so many homes.
Right.
It does somehow make it a little less of a burden
Right.
because we are such a large community. I mean, it's not, we know this is a significant ask. But if we saw another option, that would be what we would be doing. But our budget going forward simply cannot provide the same level of service without asking for an increase.
Right.
Just a related point, I mean, that's the thing, right? So if you have a lot of residential in lack of the commercial or economic development, you have that stable base, right? But there was even many years ago, every dollar of residential revenue, or I think basically you got 65 cents on the dollar when you had commercial and industrial. You basically made money off every dollar. But residential, for every dollar of, I think it was residential tax, it cost you $1.50
In
in
expense.
expenses. Because in Shrewsbury, we are largely, I don't know the exact number, it hovers always around 90%. So on the one hand, we have stability. You're going to have that tax base. On the other, we don't have, as Beth talked about, those 5 Northborough crossings. We're not going to have commercial and industrial to come in. The town is doing everything it can. You look at Lakeway Commons, you look at Edgemere, there's always looking at the town center, looking at the zoning that's through there to continue to develop the center with a New England feel. But at the same time, we're largely residential. We're largely developed through many decisions that have historically been made by our community, and our options are limited.
Right.
And that's what we face here. So it will be a distribution over the various taxpayers, absolutely, and it will not be easy for everybody. We absolutely recognize that. But we also know that residents, in terms of revenue generation versus expense, doesn't provide that same sort of opportunity that commercial and industrial. Even though we're working on it, you still have limited geography to play with.
Exactly.
Yes, and as you mentioned, John, certainly a lot of the key dates, the next steps in the process. We know we have Finance Committee hearings coming up April 10th, which as of this broadcast is this Saturday. Certainly the town election on May 4th, where the ballot question will be a yes or no, and then, of course, the town meeting will vote on whatever that budget looks like on May 22nd. As we wrap up this program, final thoughts from the panel in terms of what this question means to the town. I know we've stressed the importance of it, the urgency around a yes vote, but we obviously want to look at the other side as well. And what might happen if the town were to vote no, right? So, any final thoughts?
I think from a school department perspective, it's, I think it will be a devastating moment for educational services in this community, far worse than 2014. I don't know what we will do. The Beale School will not open. We will not be able to open the Beale School. That will be a significant issue for this community moving forward. That is, it's not going to be a good situation for us on so many levels. And I do want to, as far as the 9.5 is a big number, like Beth said. And we have had a lot of conversations with the Board of Selectmen. Those 2-2 meetings sometimes were rough. And it took a lot of work for us to all work together and get to that, but I think we have all worked really, really hard to make sure we were making the right decision for this community. And we are committed to moving forward and making sure that everybody in the community understands that we feel this is the right decision to move forward. And, thank John and Beth and all the Board of Selectmen. I think this has been a really good group to move, and, Mr. Mizikar has brought forward, to me, and I know with the school committee, a really good proposal that will move us forward.
Great. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
So a few thoughts that I have. I think you hear a lot in conversations particularly with a lot of the challenges politically on a national level and the inability to change it. You can vote, but it's very hard to change really on a day-to-day thing what happens at the national level. Right. The most profound impact that anyone can have or see in their daily lives is with their local government. Mm-hmm. And that is what we're offering here. It's an opportunity to vote with their feet, but also hopefully to reflect upon why folks moved here. I actually grew up in Shrewsbury. Yeah. I lived away, and I came back consciously. I came back here for the schools. My kids are done with the district, but I'm staying here. Right. For the town services. We have tremendous bang for our buck, whether you go to Dean Park, whether you walk the streets, any trails, winter storm, they get cleared pretty quickly. And that sense of community. This isn't 40 years ago where one parent stayed home, people stayed in the same neighborhoods for many years. People move all the time, yet in Shrewsbury, people stay a long time. Mm-hmm. Why? It's that sense of community. How have we benefited from that? Look at your home values. Mm-hmm. I remember back in 2008 during the Great Recession. And I think when I was presented this at one time to town meeting when I was on the committee, that Shrewsbury was one of those few communities that real estate values roughly held the same. Mm-hmm. The biggest investment that many of us have on a daily basis is our home. What supports that? It's simple economics of supply and demand. People want to move to Shrewsbury because we are a great community. In my opinion, we're a community worth fighting for, and that's what this represents. It was not done lightly. It was done thoughtfully. I believe it's fiscally responsible. I believe it's prudent. And I don't always like to look back at history, but if you look at how Shrewsbury has operated, we've always been fiscally responsible. There's no reason to deviate from that. Mm-hmm. And that's where history is instructive here. And I think there's just too much to lose to not vote yes. It will fundamentally change who we are, who we expect to be. And hopefully, it is a yes, all of us. It was unanimous support, Board of Selectmen, yep, the Finance Committee, and School Committee. Shrewsbury is worth fighting for, and that's why we're doing this show. That's why we'll continue to get out until May 4th, and I hope everyone feels the same way, because we're going to lose far too much if we vote no.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining this edition of School Talk, and also thank you for your partnership on this initiative. Certainly not something that we take lightly, but it's definitely something that's very critical to the town of Shrewsbury. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
Beth, John, Sandy, and thanks to you at home for watching School Talk.